This video covers 5 ProRes wrestlers who didn't get to reach their full potential. As such, it is generally a heavier subject than what's often covered on this channel, but it's not too long before you tend to run into such subjects when it comes to covering wrestling. It's just the nature of the beast, I'm afraid. The circumstances of why these wrestlers didn't reach their full potential vary wildly, and they aren't necessarily all to do with events in the ring, but covering these people does bring up a lot of emotions. There's sadness at a cruel twist of fate, regrets at lessons that weren't followed, anger at the senselessness of it all and how certain incidents could have been prevented from happening in the first place. If you're looking for something a bit more light-hearted, then, well, you're perhaps better off skipping over this one. Let's begin. The first entry here is mainly about career-ending injury, and the potential risks that not only go hand in hand with the style of ProRes, but how those risks can be amplified further in the smaller, more independent promotions where wrestlers are generally faster, hungrier, and more prone to going all out across the whole card. Such is the case of Naohiro Hoshikawa, whose career came to an abrupt end in 2004. It should be said that if you aren't familiar with Naohiro Hoshikawa's work, it's absolutely worth checking out. He was a really damn good wrestler, a man of many talents who could work damn near any style and do it well. He was something of an independent journeyman. He started out in the 90s in Michinoku Pro as a jobber, gradually moving up the card over the years. He had a chance to wrestle the legendary British wrestler Johnny Saint in a World of Sport rules match at Michinoku's highest profile card, the October 10th 1996 Lee's Days event. In 1999 he moved over to Super Delphin's Osaka Pro and stayed there for a couple of years before finding his way to Shinya Hashimoto's 01 promotion in 2001, largely staying there for the rest of his career. As a matter of fact, he and Noah's Naomichi Marufuji had the very first match in the company's history, and like a lot of Hoshikawa's matches, it was a barn burner. As far as style goes, Hoshikawa was certainly in the junior class, but not what you would call a fast junior. More like a little pit bull, with a style based on technical ability and hard hitting. Pretty similar really to the independent journeyman who he would often team with in 01 and then later feud with, Tatsuhito Takaiwa. The Takaiwa Hoshikawa team was a particularly hard-hitting one, and together they'd produced some of the best work of both of their careers, not just in 01 but also in Noah, where you can find some pretty damn good matches. There's a really excellent one in 2001 where they face off against the young team of Kenta and Marufuji, and 4 wrestlers of this class are pretty naturally going to produce some serious fireworks. Of the two, Hoshikawa was actually perhaps the better rounded worker. Takaiwa is good and certainly exciting to watch, but his style is a lot more about executing big moves without too much in the way of selling or psychology. Hoshikawa would often handle that side of things in the team. They tagged until 2004 and then they started feuding with each other. Naturally, fireworks were to be expected. On October 17, 2004, Hoshikawa and Takaiwa faced off for 01's International Junior Heavyweight title in a cage match. No footage exists of the match in question, but there are accounts of what happened. As the pair got closer to the finish of what was naturally quite an intense match, Takaiwa executed a powerbomb on Hoshikawa from the top of the cage, which was then followed by a lariat clothesline. After the clothesline, which was not the finish of the match, the referee noticed that Hoshikawa had become unresponsive and was snoring. The match was stopped immediately and Hoshikawa was rushed to hospital, where he immediately underwent surgery to stop his brain from bleeding. As with a lot of these incidents, the injury wasn't fully caused by the match with Takaiwa. Hoshikawa had suffered concussions in the weeks prior to the fateful match that had not been treated. Hoshikawa did manage to survive, although obviously his career was over. He spent a month in a coma, and the resultant brain damage would leave him in a wheelchair. In the years since, Hoshikawa has managed to stay in touch with the industry and its people. It's certainly been far from easy due to the physical and mental scars that his career-ending injury left, but he has not been forgotten. In 2013, as a commemoration for the 20th anniversary of his debut, Hoshikawa was able to get into the ring, albeit with a great deal of help, and have an exhibition of sorts against Marufuji, his other great rival. Obviously, nothing too physical occurred, with Marufuji being pinned in around a minute after a couple of slaps, but it was a nice tribute to Hoshikawa and his career. Were it not for his injury, there's no real telling where Hoshikawa could have ended up. While he'd been in action since the early 90s, he was only 29 when it happened. A lot of big Puro fans describe him as one of the best wrestlers that you may well have never heard of, and they're right. Whenever Hoshikawa got the chance to show his stuff, he went all out to do so, and was part of plenty of excellent matches. Was he as good as the likes of Kenta and Naomichi Marufuji? Well, at the time, he was definitely pretty damn close to them. What happened to him was horrible and unfortunate, but he did manage to escape with his life. Sadly, there are others who weren't so lucky. One thing that always strikes me as sad is how, perhaps like no one else here, Plum Mariko is nowadays known for just about nothing else except her death and the circumstances of it. Perhaps because her death was a rude awakening not just for Joshi, but for Japanese wrestling as a whole. The first one to happen in a pro-res ring as a consequence of injuries suffered through wrestling. It took a long time, over 40 years, but when she tragically passed, it was almost as if nothing else in her career mattered, simply because she was the first. Which is certainly a shame for a wrestler as talented and as unique as Plum Mariko. There weren't many out there who took to the ring in the same way that she did. Plum largely wrestled for JWP and was always considered a pretty high-level talent who never quite had the opportunity to break into the very top of the card, for reasons we'll explore a bit later. Her style was pretty different. She specialised in submission and was considered one of the best at this style, but as opposed to being a pure technician and mat worker like, say, Yumiko Hotta or later Mariko Yoshida, Plum used her speed to execute submissions, which is something you don't see often, certainly not in the 90s. A lot of her moves were quite exciting and daring as well, such as her favourite move, the victory roll into a cross knee breaker, which she would occasionally perform off the second rope. She innovated plenty, with her most notable move being the one that bears her name, the stretch plum. While probably most popular in the hands of Toshiaki Kawada, as the name suggests, this grounded Nelson neck crank type move is an innovation of Mariko's. Plenty of Plum's work in singles or tags comes recommended, even if there's not a whole lot of matches that would come in for a spectacular recommendation. She's just consistently very good, and very different. Of course, the reason why there perhaps isn't too much in the way of what you would call 5-star matches, aside from her career being sadly cut short, is because she never quite managed to break into the main event in spite of her talent. And there was one simple reason for that: injuries. Was Plum Mariko good enough to be in the main event? Absolutely, particularly in the early JWP. As it was, she didn't necessarily mind being more of a supporting player to the likes of Cutie Suzuki, the folks who were in the main event but were perhaps not quite as talented as someone like her. She was, by all accounts, an absolute professional and team player, highly dedicated to JWP and never one who really put herself first at all. Suzuki, JWP's main star, was Plum's best friend in the business. First and foremost, she loved wrestling and she loved to wrestle. But far too often the injuries would get in the way. They plagued her. Cruelly, at the point where she was closest to a big push in 1994, not too long after pretty high-profile inter-promotional matches against the likes of Manami Toyota, she broke her left collarbone in June and was out of action for over a year. Almost as soon as she came back in September 1995, she broke her right collarbone in a tag match and was out for another 10 months. Such injuries are quite critical to a Joshi star's career, considering how short they can be. Plum was 27 years old when she suffered her first major injury, and from that she basically didn't wrestle consistently again for over 2 years. She lost a lot of her prime, when she most probably would have been in the main event. By the time she returned, Plum was 29, which, by Joshi standards back then, would be considered on the older side. Even when she did come back in October of 1996, she and Reiko Amano fell to the arena floor when attempting to execute a top rope Frankensteiner spot, and Plum fell on her head, causing a concussion and stopping the match early. Even before the tragedy, JWP were well aware of how serious Plum's injuries had been and the effect concussions had on her, and as such she just about exclusively worked in tag matches in the middle of the card. The collarbone injuries would have ended many a wrestler's career, and topped off with the concussions she'd already suffered, they probably should have ended Plum's. However, she was persistent and didn't want to stop wrestling, to the point where, despite clearly suffering from ill effects in the ring and complaining of increased tiredness, she would refuse to give up on a match, even as these problems increasingly negatively affected her in-ring work. She'd always say when asked if she was okay that she was, even as she suffered a fair bit from quite severe headaches, and well, in those days she was taken at her word. It is quite a sad thing indeed, as while the medical check would have certainly left her no option but to retire, it would have also saved her life. But while hindsight is 2020, no one back then could have guessed just how severe the problem was. Not Plum, not her friends, not anybody. On October 15th, 1997 at the Hiroshima Sun Plaza, Plum Mariko and Bolshoi Kid faced off against Mayumi Ozaki and Reiko Amano in a tag team match. The finish went pretty much as booked. Ozaki pinned Mariko after her Liger Bomb finisher. The move was not blown in any way, and initially no one thought there was a problem. Mariko was just selling the finish. But then the wrestlers noticed that she was unconscious and that she was snoring, a sign of bleeding on the brain. She was rushed to a nearby hospital and brain surgery was performed on her, but sadly Plum Mariko never regained consciousness, and she passed away on October 17th. The doctors noted during surgery that Plum Mariko had a brain abscess which had been there for some time and was most probably caused by bumps taken inside of the ring. Much like Mitsuharu Misawa, who would also pass away inside a Hiroshima ring 12 years later, Plum's fatal injury was a cumulative one. No blame was laid at the feet of Mayumi Ozaki, who had not in any way botched the Liger Bomb. One might ask if there should have been second thoughts involved in having Mariko take a move like the Liger Bomb, but also there's no way whatsoever that Plum would have either refused to take it or would have wanted to be asked if she wanted to refuse it. In all likelihood, even if Mariko's state had been noticed immediately and there were doctors on hand in the arena, it may well not have been enough to save her life, certainly not without lasting severe brain damage. It was quite simply one bump too many, and beyond the information that became clear from surgery, little other info could be gleaned from all of it, as Mariko's father refused to let an autopsy be performed. While we can talk about post-concussion syndrome and CTE and other assorted things now as we understand the lasting effects that even a minor but persistent head trauma can have on the brain, that wasn't nearly as understood so well in 1997. Plum's legacy then is sadly wrapped up in this tragic rude awakening, an example in the worst possible way of the consequences that the particularly hard pro-res style could have and just how dangerous it was, especially as promotions continued to up the intensity and the head drops, particularly in main event matches. And for as many questions and concerns that Mariko's passing raised, it still didn't really stop people going out there and landing on their heads and necks repeatedly. There will always be a great sadness associated with watching Plum Mariko wrestle, not just for how things should have been different for her, but in how some things perhaps shouldn't have stayed the same after her. She remains a wrestler's wrestler, and certainly inside of the business she's never going to be forgotten. Tributes still run for her to this day, from shows and commemorations in Joshi to the marking of Plum Day every August 16th on her birthday. Kazuharu Sonoda isn't a name that most people would immediately recognise, even amongst dedicated pro-res fans, and yet he does have quite the legacy. Notably, he was one of the trainers for the almighty Kenta Kobashi, who debuted only a couple of months after Sonoda's untimely passing. He also had quite an important role to play in the career of his own trainer, who is probably one of the most well-known Japanese wrestlers of them all outside of pro-res circles, Akihisa Miura, better known as the Great Kabuki. Sonoda, when he was playing himself, was pretty much a mid-carder for his whole career, although he still had potential at the age of 31 when he died. As such, it can be a little tricky to find footage of him. 80s ProRes footage isn't always easy to come by as it is, and TV shows naturally concentrate a lot on main event action, but Sonoda was incredibly well respected and loved by All Japan and the other companies he worked with, an utterly solid hand and dedicated professional whether he was working as himself or under his masked identity of Magic Dragon, and quite possibly someone worthy of more, certainly because he spent a fair bit of time going above and beyond and really helping out both in the dojo and in the ring. As previously mentioned, he was training Kenta Kobashi in the mid-late 80s. He was also training Akira Taue at this time. Others to be trained by him include Yoshinari Ogawa, Hiromichi Fuyuki and Shiro Koshinaka, and he was a regular tag partner for Mitsuharu Misawa, back when Misawa was Tiger Mask, of course. In other words, Sonoda had a pretty key part to play in the early careers of 3 of the 4 pillars, and he did also team with and go up against Toshiaki Kawada a fair few times. I said previously that Sonoda had quite an important role to play in the career of his own trainer, the great Kabuki, so here goes. Back in the 80s, Kabuki found a lot of fame over in America, becoming pretty damn over as a foreign heel with Gary Hart as his manager. At first, Kabuki appeared exclusively for World Class, but as he became more in demand from other territories, Hart and Kabuki would take bookings outside of the territory and thus make plenty more cash. At least until Fritz von Erich got wind of what they were doing and forbade them from doing it any further. This was a bit of a pickle, as they'd already agreed to do a run in Georgia with Ole Anderson, who was furious at the thought of cancelling Kabuki, seeing as he had been advertised pretty extensively. However, Hart and Kabuki managed to sort it. They decided to use Kabuki's old trainee, Sonoda. They convinced Ole that Sonoda would happily be able to don the Kabuki costume and fans would be none the wiser. He had a similar body type, was more than capable, and as Kabuki's trainee he knew just about everything that he did in the ring. And in the end, it all worked out fine. Sonoda filled the booking and pulled it off smoothly. So the arrangement continued, with Sonoda taking smaller events as Kabuki, while Mira took the bigger ones. In the end, both were making money. As a thank you for his work, Mira offered Sonoda a spot on a 5-week wrestling tour of South Africa that was being booked by Tigerjeet Singh. This tour would have been very lucrative, and certainly in normal circumstances, it was a booking that Mira would have taken. The recently married Sonoda happily took it, thinking it would also double up as a nice honeymoon for him and his wife Mayumi. Giant Bubba gave his blessing all away, paying not just for the flight to South Africa, but for the entire honeymoon. All should have worked out well. Sadly, the flight in question was South African Airways Flight 295. 35 minutes into the flight to Johannesburg, a fire broke out in the cargo bay, quickly engulfing the entire back end of the plane. As the electrics failed and the pilots prepared for an emergency landing, the extreme heat of the fire broke off the back end of the plane and it crashed into the Indian Ocean, leaving no survivors. Kazuharu Sonoda, his wife Mayumi, and all 159 other passengers and crew were killed in the tragedy. The story was worldwide news, of course, but the death of an All Japan pro wrestler on the flight was certainly a big part of the reports in Japan. Another All Japan wrestler, Raja Lion, narrowly avoided Flight 295. He was booked on the tour and on the plane, but chose to take a later flight at the last minute. For both Akihisa Mira and Giant Bubba, the grief they felt from this horrible tragedy was strong, as was the guilt. Both felt like they were to blame somewhat for it all, and even if that's obviously not the case, it's a perfectly natural reaction. Indeed, according to a lot of people, Bubba never fully got over the passing of Sonoda. It was something that stayed with him all the way to his own death in 1999. That is perhaps not too surprising. After all, as we have mentioned before, the All Japan locker room was, for Giant Bubba and his wife Motoko, kind of like a family. The pair had no children of their own, and they were intensely loyal to their flock as a result of that. Therefore, the impact of losing Sonoda must have truly hurt a great deal. A certain lasting legacy for Sonoda exists in the success of his famous trainees, but Sonoda may well have done a great deal more on his own had he continued to live. As a frequent partner of Tiger Mask in All Japan, he may well have fit in somewhere during the transitory period that was soon to come, when the new guard, led by Misawa, took on the older Jumbo Tsuruta and company. Even if he may well have never been a main event star, he certainly had plenty to give, not just as part of another wrestler's identity, but as himself. Sadly, we'll never know just how much. I suppose this is kind of an odd entry. Rikidozan. One might wonder why the man who is basically the father of pro-res would be here, seeing as relatively speaking no single pro-res wrestler has ever been as well known or as influential as Rikidozan. Only Inoki and Baba come close. Without him, there is no pro-res. He transcends wrestling in the country completely. The matches he had with the likes of Fred Blassie and Lou Fez were about more than just putting on a spectacle inside the ring ropes. They were a matter of helping to restore Japan's shattered national identity after World War II. I'm not sure really if the simple act of pro wrestling has ever spoken to an entire nation in the same way that Rikidozan's matches did. He's a national hero for a damn good reason. Not bad at all really for an ex-Rikishi who, unbeknownst to many, hailed from the country that would become North Korea, something he kept secret due to the prejudice often faced by Koreans in Japanese society. And yet, despite Rikidozan's incredible fame, his death remains a large part of his legacy. He died early, murdered, aged 39 in December 1963. It's a large part not simply for the act itself, but for its senselessness and how easily preventable his death was. It could have so easily not happened. The fight itself started on the evening of December 8th at the New Latin Quarter nightclub in Tokyo, when he was talking to a woman and he accused Takashi Murata, a yakuza, of stepping on his shoes, promptly taking the man down and pummeling him. An unnecessary fight soon escalated when Murata, as a defensive move, produced a knife and stabbed Rikidozan once in the abdomen, at which point the wounded Riki went to the hospital. An obstetrics hospital, mind you, because he didn't want to attract media attention. He had surgery and then he went back home. Even at this point, Rikidozan wasn't considered to be in danger, so long as he had good aftercare. Unfortunately, Rikidozan, along with actually meeting the man who stabbed him, who was promptly told to apologise profusely after a further beating from his gan, would essentially continue to drink alcohol and eat rich food as soon as he got home, and ultimately this doomed him. With his condition worsening, he was readmitted to hospital a week after the incident and operated on again, but he had developed peritonitis, and on the night of December 15th, he passed away, leaving an utterly shocked nation. Murata was ultimately charged with manslaughter, for which he served 8 years, and every year up to his own death in 2013, he would visit Rikidozan's grave on the anniversary of his passing and call his sons, Yoshihiro and Mitsuo, to apologise for what he had done. When we think of Rikidozan and this tragic death, it makes sense then to also think of what might have been if it hadn't happened. How different does pro-res look if Rikidozan lives? It is certainly quite fortunate that before his death, he had managed to secure what would basically be a succession. He knew full well that his 2 star pupils, Antonio Inoki and especially Giant Baba, would be massive stars in their own right. And yet the death of Rikidozan would thrust this pair, both still in their mid-20s, directly into the forefront of a company, the JWA, that would struggle greatly after Rikidozan's murder. Not just with the tragedy, but with the scandal that followed as a whole load of Yakuza connections were revealed. With Baba as the main event star and Inoki, after a couple of want-away years, as his tag partner, the JWA's ship was ultimately righted. Although by the early 70s neither Baba nor Inoki saw a future in the ailing JWA, they went their separate ways, forming All Japan and New Japan respectively, and the original JWA faded into history. If you want more on this, there's a whole other big video all about Baba and Inoki's rivalry and what ultimately happened with the JWA. The big question, and really why I've placed Rikidozan here, is mainly to do with an alternate timeline. What happens if Rikidozan lives? Does any of this actually occur? We obviously don't know, but it's a thought experiment. As far as what's known about Rikidozan around the time of his death, we know he was a man with a lot of fingers in a lot of pies, and more than a few connections to the underworld. He lived hard, he wasn't in the best of condition, and he was increasingly paranoid near the end of his life, sleeping with a pistol under his pillow. If he never got into a fight at the New Latin Quarter, that doesn't necessarily mean ProRes doesn't get embroiled in scandal down the line, but as we reach the end of the decade and he enters his mid-40s, how quick would he have been to pass that torch over? Rikidozan certainly made a lot of his fame, and let's face it, who can blame him? So even if at the time of his death he knew just how much potential Inoki and Baba had, would he have been reluctant to actually take a back seat to these young lions? Considering how long some Puro stars have had to wait to take top spots that really they should have attained years prior to them doing so, one does wonder. There's many other questions, of course. If Rikidozan lives, how long does the JWA live? Is it possible that the JWA even survives to this very day? Perhaps if one of or even both of Inoki and Baba decide to stick around? We may not get that situation which sees both New Japan and All Japan form, and we don't get to truly see just what Rikidozan would have been in his later years, as he gradually would have stepped further away from the ring and more towards the office. And to be honest, we really don't know if that would have been a positive or a negative outcome for ProRes as a whole, really. It is honestly one of the great what-ifs in the entire history of pro wrestling, and a scenario in which Rikidozan never gets his shoes stepped on and lives is one that's quite interesting to try and game out. No matter what would have happened, today's world of Puro would have surely been completely different, if indeed it existed at all. Okay, this isn't going to be easy. Probably why I left this one to the end. You can't talk about Puro wrestlers who didn't reach their potential and not mention Hana Kimura, but this tragedy is one that's still sore, 5 years later. 2020 was a horrible year in many ways, an awful one for premature deaths in wrestling, and the week in which we lost both Hana and Shad Gaspard in tragic circumstances was a notably crushing one for many people. There's a lot to say about it and, well, there's a lot of anger. Hana Kimura was seen by everyone as someone with a lot of potential, even beyond a lot of second-generation wrestlers. The daughter of Joshi star Kyoko Kimura, she just had, well, that kind of innate and tough-to-describe thing called star quality, a certain swagger and charisma that some wrestlers have in which everything they do just seems to be natural, no matter what. She worked for Stardom, Wrestle Run, Ring of Honor and various other promotions, and did a lot in just a few years. She won titles, became leader of the Tokyo Cyber Squad faction, went roaring up the card almost immediately, and received a hell of a lot of positive notes saying that she was one to watch. At the start of 2020, she got the chance to light up the Tokyo Dome in a dark tag match with fellow Stardom wrestlers Julia, Arisa Hoshiki and Mayu Iwatani at the New Japan Wrestle Kingdom card. A historic moment indeed, the first women's match at the Dome since 2002. Hana was always someone who appeared quite down-to-earth and relatable too. She was always aware of certain pressures that were on her shoulders and difficulties that she had. There was the pressure, of course, of being a second-generation wrestler, and the feeling of having to step out of her mother's shadow as a still quite young star who'd only debuted in 2016. There were also difficulties that came with being mixed race in Japanese society, something that even to this day can still cause issues and prejudices to come up. Also, the very identity of being a professional wrestler was something that she was determined to have taken seriously, something that wasn't necessarily always smooth going. None of these things would appear to be at an ordinary time like an incredibly critical issue, but they're feelings that can be thoroughly amplified on a reality TV show. The reality show that Hana appeared on, Terrace House, was a popular one that won praise for a feeling of authenticity and a belief that what you saw on television was very natural and unscripted. Unlike a lot of reality shows, it's not ostensibly about anything beyond a group of young people living together, similar in vein to MTV's old real-world shows. This is all, of course, an illusion. Terrace House is a reality show in much the same vein as every other, with the need to construct certain narratives, to build characters, and to use a great deal of scripting in order to do this. And none of this changes no matter how many people called it a realistic view of people in Japan, or stroked their chins and compared it to the work of Yasujiro Ozu or whatever. This certainly wasn't enough to save the show in the wake of tragedy, after which it was promptly cancelled. Just like any other reality show, the people on Terrace House were immediately subjected to the whims of public opinion and the mischiefs of cyberbullies, something that affects just about everyone who appears on reality TV, no matter how they're presented. Even before the incident on the show that attracted a lot of attention, when Hana got angry at another housemate for washing a wrestling costume that had a great deal of both monetary and sentimental value, an argument which itself was purposefully staged and dramatised by the show's staff, the trolls and abusive comments were ever present for her, as they were for everyone. But after this incident, one of the more explosive moments in a show not necessarily known for them, they were amplified tenfold. The result of this was the worst possible outcome. A young woman with the world at her feet and so much time ahead of her takes her own life. Hana Kimura was only 22 years old. The usual articles would run with the shock and the thought that we just couldn't have ever seen this coming, which is of course totally true in a way. And yet in the world of reality TV, or whenever the media crashes into an ordinary person's life when they don't expect it, something like this happening isn't necessarily uncommon. The horrible thing is that nothing ever seems to be done to actually prevent it. Too often there isn't enough aftercare for those who appear on programmes like these, and reality TV in all its various guises, whether it's a group of young folks being put together for a couple of months, adults trying to win a competition, or some sordid tabloid talk show where we pry into the affairs of strangers, is a rather naked example of the media machine chewing regular people up and spitting them out, too often with disastrous consequences. Honestly, it doesn't even feel right to use the death of Hana Kimura in this way, even. But a large part of that is because we shouldn't be talking about this at all. This segment shouldn't exist because she should still be here. To call this a case of a wrestler who didn't get to fulfill their potential goes without saying. This is a person who didn't get the chance to fulfill their potential, who had a whole life to go through that was cut apart by reality TV and the predatory trolls who scour it looking for targets. Her legacy still lives on, of course. Her mother, Kyoko, continues to run the memorial show for Hana every year where not just Joshi but Puroresu as a whole gathers at the Korakuen Hall to pay tribute, as well as the Remember Hana Foundation that seeks to combat bullying in all of its forms. Make no mistake, she will never be forgotten, but she will always be missing. There's nothing else to say, really. Rest in peace to Hana Kimura, Plum Mariko, Kazuharu Sonoda, and Rikidozan. Bye for now.